October the 9th, 1965, Wakefield, West Yorkshire. A Saturday like any other. The sun hung low in the sky as autumn settled over the Horbury Sand Quarry. 14-year-old Elsie Frost had spent the afternoon with her school sailing club. She was bright, responsible and full of promise. But as she walked home that day, someone was waiting. This is the story about a young girl who was taken far too young. It's also the story of how a police investigation failed so badly. We're also going to talk about a man who was wrongfully accused and spent 50 years until he was exonerated, taking the blame for not just one murder, but for many serious crimes. And then we're also going to touch upon a family and how it destroyed them, as well as a 50-year wait for justice. Elsie was a model student and she studied at Snapethorpe High School. She was well liked, she was known for her kindness. She was also a prefect, which was a role that she took on and absolutely loved doing. The death of Elsie, it was big news back in 1965. A young girl, a 14-year-old girl, whose life was cruelly taken in such a horrific manner. But what happened that day? What was Elsie doing that day leading up to the attack itself? Well, we're going to visit several locations throughout today's video. We're going to visit a lagoon where she was on the day of the tragic event itself. She had been there helping fellow pupils, if you will, or young children learning how to sail on the lagoon. She always volunteered to go there with the school and with some of the teachers, most weekends, most Saturdays. But it was a role she absolutely loved doing. So we're going to visit the lagoon, make our way back along this stretch of canal path. We're going to retell the story of Elsie Frost, and we're going to get into the botched police investigation as well, and how they got it so badly wrong. Now behind me is Horbury Lagoon, and it was here where Elsie spent October the 9th, the afternoon, helping friends, colleagues, younger people, showing them how to sail. This was something that she really loved to do. But she made her way from here shortly after 3:30, heading towards 3:45 that afternoon. We are going to follow the route back to where she would sadly be murdered. And we're going to recount the story in full as best we can. And there is one important part of this story we need to tell. And it's important in that if Elsie had only taken a different path home, chances are she would be still alive to this very day. And she would have gone on to enjoy a life full of joy itself, maybe children, grandchildren, holidays and everything else that life brings. But we will mention that as we walk back. By 3:50 p.m, Elsie was ready to head home. She said goodbye to her friends and chose a quiet route, a path alongside the Calder and Hebble navigation, which led to an underpass beneath the railway line. She was dressed in a yellow cardigan, printed skirts, red anorak and wearing a brand new pair of leather shoes. Elsie chose to walk along the canal towpath, and police have questioned the route she took and whether or not she planned to meet somebody. But friends later suggested she may have taken the secluded ABC tunnel route to avoid muddying the shoes. What happened in the next 15 minutes has remained one of Britain's most baffling and haunting crimes. Elsie's friends took a detour to the left side, whereas Elsie carried on going on the right hand side of the path. We are going to go in that direction and follow the footsteps, retrace the footsteps of Elsie. But I'll just show you what's on the left. And like I said, I think, or we believe, that's the direction her friends took on that fateful day. Now, if only Elsie had gone with them, like I said, she may well have been alive to this very day, and we wouldn't be here now retelling this tragic story. But we're going to carry on going to the right-hand side, and we're going to retrace the steps of poor Elsie and retelling her story as we do so. It was at around 4:15 that afternoon when a man by the name of Thomas Brown was out walking his dog. He also had his 2 young children with him at the time, and he noticed what looked like the figure of a young child lying at the bottom of the ABC steps. We're going to go to those steps shortly. But he told his children to stay at the top and not to look, because he just had this feeling that whatever was lying down on those steps, they may well have been seriously injured, and he didn't want his children to see this. But it was only when he went to see for himself that the true horror of what had occurred to young Elsie would fully show itself. Now, where Elsie Frost was horrifically attacked by persons unknown was just at the opposite side of this tunnel. And it was at the bottom of a set of steps known locally as the ABC steps. ABC simply because of the 26 steps. And obviously there's 26 letters in the alphabet. Like with many stories that myself and Vicky have covered over the years, this one is no different in that we visit these locations to tell the stories, to retell those stories, I should say. And it is never a nice feeling when you are stood close to or at the actual spot of where obviously these horrific crimes took place. And just to my right now, I'm looking at the steps themselves from where young Elsie would sadly lose her life. But many believe it was inside this tunnel behind me, where she was brutally, savagely attacked, like I said, by persons unknown at this point, and she would sadly lose her life at the bottom of these steps. Elsie had been stabbed 5 times, 2 wounds to the back, 2 to the head, and 1 defensive wound to one of her hands. One of these stab wounds was a severe blow which pierced her heart, and despite her injuries, she managed to get up and stagger over to the steps before collapsing. Now, whilst we can't quite get to the top of the old ABC steps, too much undergrowth and it's just too dangerous, we do have photographs that were taken by the police and the forensics at the time of the discovery of Elsie's body, looking down and towards the tunnel entrance itself. And you do see the police officers walking up with a dog. There's also other photographs which show the police at the entrance of the tunnel. But these are certainly the ABC steps. We've just spoken to a local man who was just walking through here with his dog. And he has just said exactly what I have just touched upon about how these places, these areas where these horrific crimes took place, he was just saying how weird it kind of feels walking through this underpass. He says he does it at least 4 times a week to walk his dog. He said, and it's every time he gets to this spot and where obviously the attack would have taken place and obviously where Elsie herself died. He said he always gets a chill, a funny feeling knowing what happened here over 50 years ago. And this is exactly what I was touching upon. Every time me and Vicky come out and cover these stories, we get that same feeling. Now, we're not saying it's a paranormal feeling, we're not going down that road. Perhaps it's just something to do with respect, and obviously we're being at these locations, you know, we don't want to be disrespectful in how we retell the stories. But I'm so glad that that gentleman who walked past stopped And, you know, we had the pleasure of speaking and talking to him, and he summed it up perfectly. There is a certain feeling, there's a certain chill every time he walks past this area. And just behind me are the ABC steps, like I said, where Elsie was sadly found. And she was lifeless at that time. It's truly horrific, it really is. The hunt for Elsie's killer was immediate and it was intense. Over 12,000 people would be spoken to and over 1,200 statements were taken. Police went door to door asking people what their movements were, what their whereabouts were on October the 9th from between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock that afternoon. Then came a breakthrough, or so the police thought. And it was in January 1966, just months after the brutal murder of 14-year-old Elsie, that the coroner's inquest made a startling claim. It was on the 5th day of an inquest into the murder of Elsie that a man by the name of Ian Bernard Spencer, an unemployed railway fireman, was recalled to the witness box at Wakefield. The coroner, Mr. Philip Gill, he was quite damning and quite firm with Ian Spencer. And he would call him out to be a liar whilst being interviewed, whilst being questioned at the actual inquest itself. He didn't believe Mr. Spencer's version of events and what transpired that day. And Mr. Gill would, like I said, he would publicly call Spencer a liar. And that there were at least 3, if not more, people who witnessed Mr. Spencer at Harbury Lagoon at around 4 o'clock that afternoon. Now, Mr. Spencer stood his ground. He said, well, that's impossible. They've got it wrong. I was at home between 3:30 and 3:40 p.m. that day. So it wasn't me they were seeing at the lagoon. But yet Mr. Gill argued and argued. And he kept pushing Spencer to basically say something that wasn't true. He wanted him to admit to something he never did. And that was to murder Elsie Frost. Mr. Gill said, we have spent 5 days now going through the evidence and fitting it together piece by piece, like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. One piece doesn't fit, the evidence you have given. It is the last remaining piece and it doesn't fit. Now, Mr. Gill tried goading Ian into admitting, like I said, to something he had never done. Mr. Spencer, like I said, he stood his ground. And at one point, and after Mr. Gill had finished with his questioning, Spencer simply replied saying, it is impossible, I didn't do it. Now, Mr. Gill finished his questioning by saying to Ian, I am giving you the opportunity of telling the jury what the truthful explanation is of your movements on that day. I am warning you with all the earnest I can that your evidence completely fails to fit in. Mr. Spencer, being polite as ever, went on to thank Mr. Gill for giving him the opportunity to speak. But again, he stood his ground and he said that everything he has spoken of up to now is correct, is truthful. He wasn't responsible for the murder of Elsie Frost. Unfortunately, it was the unanimous verdict of the jury and it came that Elsie Frost had been murdered and that there was a case against Ian Bernard Spencer, effectively accusing him of the crime. On the 12th of January 1966, many newspapers ran with dramatic headlines. Many would say that a man had been charged with the willful murder of Elsie Frost. And the coroner himself made an unusual statement by giving the name Ian Bernard Spencer to the press. And the press had a field day with this. Now, in March of 1966, Ian Spencer will be cleared of any wrongdoing or any involvement in the death of Elsie Frost. Appearing at the Leeds courts, again, these questions would be put to him, but ultimately, the judge, they would rule that Spencer didn't have a case to answer to. There was no evidence, there was nothing to prove conclusively that Ian Bernard Spencer was at the lagoon till at least 4 p.m. that afternoon. And Spencer himself would walk free from court as a free man. But the weight and the presence, the pressure of being accused, being publicly named in all the newspapers, weighed heavily on Ian Spencer's head. And he would go on to live 50 years of prosecution. And it got to a point in his life where he had to keep diaries of any crimes that were local to where he was living at the time. Because police were coming around to his house, where he was living, where he was renting, asking what his movements were when these other crimes were being committed. We don't know the extent, the nature of the crimes. We don't know if it was murder, robbery, assaults, we don't know. But we know the police certainly always went to Spencer's home address to see where he was. But it got to the point where Spencer had had enough. So he began keeping notes. He began writing diary entries each and every time he heard of something bad happening in the news. And he would have proof as to what his whereabouts were during these periods, these episodes. Elsie's mother would later tell reporters, "I know what Mr. Spencer and his wife must have suffered. I am glad for their sakes it's over. I am sure they will be as anxious as I am to have the killer found." So why did Elsie Frost's killer slip through the net? I mean, with so many people in the area that day, it's almost unthinkable that the investigation stalled so quickly, but it did. There were blood trails leading from the site of the attack down to the base of the ABC steps. This itself was a witness to the violence that had occurred back on October the 9th, 1965. But why had the killer slipped the net? Now, close to the scene of the crime, a 12-inch tan leather knife sheath marked with a stag's head emblem had been discarded over a wall. There were other clues. Sightings of a bearded hitchhiker on a nearby road and an unknown, well-dressed man behind the wheel of an Austin Cambridge parked suspiciously close to the scene. And this man was never identified. Now, with Mr. Jill prematurely naming Ian Spencer as the murderer, the culprit for Elsie Frost's death, this basically meant the police turned a blind eye to any other witness statements, any other possible clues, any other sightings of strange people. Those sightings of other people were never investigated fully. And none so was the sighting of a bearded man with bushy hair. Now, this bearded man with bushy hair, like I said, would prove to be very important years later when the family of Elsie Frost went back to the police and asked them to reopen the case files. The case itself would go extremely cold from 1966 onwards, with no further investigations, no further clues, no further witnesses coming forward, until the family, like I said, pleaded with the police to reopen those case files. Now, it wasn't until that cold case review in 2015 that the truth began to surface. New forensic and psychological evidence pointed to another man entirely. Peter Pickering, a convicted murderer later dubbed the Beast of Wunwell. With Ian Spencer being exonerated from anything to do with the murder of Elsie Frost, the case itself became a cold case. And over the years, witnesses that could have been interviewed were never interviewed. Important information, clues, was forgotten. Now, in that time, a lot of conspiracy theories and rumours soon began to spread. And one of the rumours that came out of all this was that Elsie may well have disturbed 2 young men in a homosexual act. I don't want to be too descriptive, but it was rumoured that Elsie may well have disturbed 2 young men performing a homosexual act. One story came out that one of the men scarpered away whilst the other man chased Elsie before murdering her. Now, we have to remember that back in 1965, homosexual activity it was illegal in the United Kingdom. So if this rumour is true, then obviously this couple were frightened that Elsie was going to go and report them. Obviously give a description of them. They may have lived local, we don't know. It does seem more likely that it was indeed a rumour and there was no truth to it. But this just gives a prime example of how when a case goes cold, a cold case, a lot of rumours, a lot of made up stories do become more prevalent, and it can kind of water down what actually happened. And this was certainly one of those instances where a rumour spread, it spread like wildfire, and a lot of people began to talk about this encounter with two homosexual young men. Elsie was cremated at the Wakefield crematorium on Wednesday the 13th of October 1965. And it's here at that crematorium where we're going to try and find a tree that was planted in her memory back in 2015. And this was all arranged by her brother and sister, Colin and Anne. The two people that fought so bravely for justice for their sister. And if it wasn't for their campaigning, like I touched upon in the video, there's a good chance that Pickering, his name may never well have been linked with the murder of their sister. And in some respects, whilst justice has never been fully served, one would argue and say at least they got some closure, because the inquiry in 2019, in November of that year, the coroner simply stated, didn't he, that Pickering himself was most likely the perpetrator, the person responsible for the murder of Elsie Frost. So we could argue and say the family kind of got some closure, but I guess we'll never fully know the truth. Was Pickering responsible for the murder of Elsie, or wasn't he? It was exactly 50 years to the day, October the 9th, 2015, when Colin and Anne released 14 doves into the sky at St George's Church in Lupset, not too far from where we are now here at Wakefield Crematorium. They released 14 doves, one to mark each year of Elsie's life. She was 14 years old when she was sadly taken from us. That same day, they also came here to Wakefield Crematorium to plant a tree in memory of their sister Elsie. Fortunately, thankfully, we have managed to find that tree, and there is a little plaque at the foot of it which is nicely worded, pure respect for young Elsie, and there are a few other little markers, but we'll turn you guys around now and you can see for yourself exactly what I'm looking at now. For today's story, we aren't leaving a purple rose. Instead, we're going to leave a white rose, because this is a remembrance tree. It isn't the actual resting place of Elsie herself. We know she was cremated just a few days after the discovery of her body. So as a mark of respect, we are placing a white rose in one of the pots that are alongside the plaque. And the plaque itself says, "This tree was planted by Wakefield Council to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the death of Wakefield schoolgirl Elsie Frost, aged 14. Elsie is remembered by her family, friends and the community of Wakefield. Always missed, always remembered, always loved. February the 7th, 1951, October the 9th, 1965. And there's our white rose. May she rest in peace, and may she never, ever be forgotten." There are similar plaques and markers here to remember Elsie and the parents of Elsie herself, such as this love art. "Mum and Dad, two golden hearts stopped beating. Hard-working hands at rest. It broke our hearts to see you go. We've really lost the best." And then there's a butterfly Butterflies appear when angels are near, in loving memory of our sister Sandra and John. And there's a little plaque there for my auntie. So this is the memorial tree, like I said, for that young innocent young girl, 14-year-old Elsie Frost, whose life was tragically taken in such brutal way back in 1965. Sadly for Elsie's parents, they passed away without any answers, but her brother Colin and sister Anne never gave up. And in 2015, their quiet campaign caught national attention. A BBC Radio 4 programme reopened public interest in the case, and that same year West Yorkshire Police launched a fresh investigation called Operation Plain Lake. Now, despite evidence being destroyed or misplaced, over 100 new lines of inquiries were reopened, and the police launched a full and new investigation into the murder of Elsie Frost. Now, Peter Pickering was already in prison at the time because of another killing that he committed, another murder he committed, I should say, back in 1972. But it would be evidence that the police would soon discover in a storage unit or storage units that Pickering himself was renting out. The evidence itself came in the form of diary entries and scribblings, jottings in notebooks, and they were quite damning. Pickering would leave subtle clues as to crimes he had committed and things he wanted to do to young girls especially. The police themselves, it would be difficult for them to prove that Pickering was involved in the murder of Elsie Frost. But eventually it would come out that they felt that they indeed would have enough evidence to charge the man with her murder. Not just diary entries and logbooks, exercise books and notepad jottings. The police also found many items of torture and ways to fasten up people, such as with the use of handcuffs. The jottings themselves in the notebooks, they revealed a warped mind of Pickering. And some of the entries were quite graphic, detailing how he wanted to commit sexual violence and torture towards young women and young girls. Now, Pickering died in 2018, just weeks before he would be charged with the murder of Elsie Frost. Now, it was only after his death that Detective Superintendent Nick Wallen, he would tell reporters, the press, that Pickering was the man they had arrested and that he had been interviewed over a period of 2 years in connection with the murder of Elsie Frost. They felt that they had enough evidence at this point to have charged Pickering with her murder. Unfortunately, they never got the luxury of doing this because he died in 2018. The family, therefore, never got full closure into what happened to Elsie Frost back in 1965. The parents of Elsie most certainly didn't get any closure. Like I said, they passed away before Pickering was arrested and obviously was going to be charged with her murder. So it's an awful tale where, yet again, a potential perpetrator of such an horrific crime has seemingly got away with it. He may well have been charged and sentenced for the murder of another young girl back in 1972, but for the family of Elsie, they never got the closure that they fully deserved. And if it wasn't for Colin and Anne, the brother and sister of Elsie, who campaigned relentlessly over the years to reopen the files, then perhaps Pickering himself, his name may never have been mentioned or linked to the murder of Elsie Frost. And this itself would have been tragic and truly sad. It would have been awful if he'd have died and there was no clues linking him to the murder of Elsie Frost. Now, the thing we do have to be mindful with this is we will never know if Pickering was indeed the man responsible. This is one thing I doubt we will ever know. People may ask questions about, was there any DNA, was there any samples taken from the clothing in 1965 that could have been used today to match up DNA with Pickering? To that question, I honestly can't answer it. We do not know. We don't know if there was any samples taken at the time. But one thing still remains, and that is Pickering died before he could be charged and before he could face a jury. And that is truly, truly sad. It really is sad. In 2019, a new inquest in November took place into the death of Elsie Frost, with a coroner ruling that she was unlawfully murdered, which obviously sounds quite obvious right now. But more interestingly, the coroner went on to say that the person most likely to have been involved in her death was that of Pickering. Again, too little too late.
Elsie's family knew police wanted to charge Pickering, but he died last year while serving time for a separate murder, so this was as far as they could go.
We've got a jigsaw puzzle almost complete, except for one piece. So we have not and will never have complete justice for the murder of our sister.
We've got as good as we can get today. We're grateful to the coroner for actually naming Peter Pickering in his summing up. That helps us a lot.
The coroner said it was for the police, not him, to draw conclusions on possible suspects, but he described Pickering as dangerous and devious. We heard that before his death, police found notes and diary entries by Pickering, including, "Who attacked that girl in 1965? I could be wrong. All I know is I can't believe I killed, but something in me comes to the surface saying, but you did. I never wanted or intended to go out and do what I did. A child."
This individual, this dangerous sexual homicidal predator, was responsible for Elsie's death in 1965. I'm absolutely convinced of that.
If only the police had done the due diligence back in 1966 when they were implicating Ian Spencer. If only they'd have listened to some witnesses, and especially those that were describing a man with a bushy beard and bushy hair being at the lagoon in or around 3:30 and 4 p.m. that afternoon. Perhaps Pickering may have been picked up and arrested and questioned much sooner. Obviously, it wouldn't have stopped Elsie's murder, but it may have given the family closure. But again, they were so focused on the Ian Spencer story and his version of events that the case went cold, and more so in 1966 and after Spencer himself was exonerated from any wrongdoing. Now, for those that have watched our channel and obviously seen plenty of the other videos we've covered, we actually covered the story of Wendy Su, another young girl who was murdered in 1972 in Bakewell. Now, when we were reading this case and we were doing the case notes, we actually found an article which said that Pickering was also mentioned for perhaps being involved with the murder of Wendy Su. Now, nothing came of that in the end, but certainly his name was linked to that brutal slaying back in 1972. Now, we'll leave links down below in the description for that video, so please go and watch that and tell us your thoughts on that one. Do you think Pickering may have been involved in that, as well as obviously the murder of Elsie and of the murder in 1972 of that other 14-year-old young girl?